So in this set of mentoring moments where we're thinking about the emotionally healthy life of a leader, I'm going to share with you, as the last one in the series, was probably my most troubling one for my life. I struggled with this one more than any of the others. And if Pete Scazzaro didn't mention it in his book, I would not have wrestled with it to this very day. But he describes a concept like this. He says, live with a Sabbath delight. Now, my confession is I lived for much of my life in ministry as a workaholic, and I'm not proud of that. What I often did was have this strong sense that I couldn't do enough for God. Now, in a pure motive, that might be fine, but I think the shadow side of my life was also saying I could never do enough and never do it right. And so I became a workaholic. Now, I justified that like most addicts do. I justified it by saying that the Sabbath was an old Jewish principle. We should draw from the principle. But I didn't actually have a habit of practice either. So I would look at the Sabbath and say, well, sure, it was one of the 10 commandments. It's one of the big 10. So I would comprehend that at an emotional level. But I never got it down from my head to my heart, where I actually would practice it. I would read stories where Jesus would talk to the Pharisees and he would chide them for being more concerned about keeping the Sabbath than helping people. And I would kind of like, I don't have to keep the Sabbath. I'm going to help people all the time. And I was missing something pretty central here. I was missing the second half of what Jesus said when he said the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So I would get the second part, but I missed the first part, and the Sabbath was made for man. I thought of it primarily as a way of like taking time off, but I'm going to share with you 3 of the principles that I really missed. And as I have recently leaned into them, I've discovered they're powerful. Actually, they're very wholesome and healing in the way that they work. And one of them is that we work from our rest. Instead of like we work till all we can do is rest. We collapse. And then we work some more. And that's the way I lived a whole lot of my ministry. There was a lot of me in ministry. And that wasn't always good, by the way. But the principle of the Sabbath is not that before creation, God was at rest. And out of his rest, he created the world in 6 days. And then he rested again. God didn't need rest. The rest wasn't necessarily for him. The rest was for us. The rest was to teach us this principle of life that we work from rest. So when a certain day comes or a certain time comes, and by the way, the Jews practiced the Sabbath on Friday night at sundown and went to Saturday night at sundown. I don't think you have to be legalistic in when you do it, but I think the fact that you would give a 24-hour time block to God so that you would take time to rest and to recreate, like get some recreation in there, some play if you want, but give a generous portion of that time back to God. And in doing that, what you do is you're replenished. So then when you go back to work, and if you have this every 6 days, when you go back to work, then you're working out of your rest. You're working out of strength. You're being able to, it's like a resource or an asset that you can bring to life and ministry, and you're working out of rest. And it gives more rhythm and it gives more strength to your week. So I was missing that part of it. Another part that I was missing was that I had never made this association until Pete Scazzaro did in his book. He talked about how most Christians would say, oh, I believe in the tithe. I'm going to give 1/10 of all of my income back to God. And by the way, God says to give that first, kind of like just like the Sabbath, rest first. Because the Sabbath is the first day of your week. And so in the tithe, we would say, well, God can do more with the 90% than I could with 100. And we would pound the table on that perhaps. But in a similar way, God can do more with 6 days in your life of work than he can with 7. Now, I would practice it in the tithe, but I didn't practice it with my time. But as I began to like tithe of my time, I know it is 1/7 and 1/10, so forget that for a moment. But as I would put a place of rest and Sabbath delight first in my life, what it reminded me of was God is on the throne. Like he's got it. So I don't have to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders because like the song says, he's got the whole world in his hands. He's got you and me, brother, in his hands. Like God has got it. And for every 6 days, I can just take a whole day off and not think about work at all. That is so healing and encouraging and helpful. In fact, when I'm back at work the other 6 days, I'm remembering God's got this. Like I can rest and give it to him and he's got it. He's God, I'm not. That's a really good position to take in life. And then the final thing I'd share with you today, because this is meant to be kind of a jumping off point. I'm curious to hear how you'll talk about this in your cohorts. But here's the other thing I learned. I needed a sacred space in my life, not just daily in a time of devotions. I do need that for sure. But I needed time to have more of a generous, sacred place, whether I'm reading a book or whether I'm journaling or I'm going out for a run or riding my bike or taking a long walk. When I regularly can give God like extra time to be the focus of my life, it's delightful. It's helpful. It's encouraging. It's refreshing. And it's sacred. So much of our life isn't sacred. We're in a secular world trying hard to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. Now, God brings it. We don't bring it. But we're trying to, by our activities, allow for him to do what only he can do in life. When we regularly take time for sacred space, there's something special that happens in that it seems to permeate the work we do after it. That we can almost return to that place where we were with God when we're dealing with a difficult situation in the boardroom, or we're supporting a person who's had loss, or we're trying to prepare a sermon when we're distracted. And we can regularly go back to that time I have with God. And when we can stand before God, we can always stand before men. And that sacred time in life just seems to be like a sweet perfume through the rest of our life. So I'm learning, and I invite you to go on this journey of exploring what it means to have a Sabbath delight.